All are taking your own conditions into account before heading out on this tour, because if there is a medical emergency in the cave, rescue from the cave can and will take several hours. So if you have any heart or breathing problems, difficulty walking long distances, a walker, I'll be setting the pace. And when you're in the front, you're also going to get a little bit more time to rest at our pit stops on the tour. Now folks, the cave is dimly lit and the trails can be uneven, so make sure to watch your step and watch your head.
Oh, look at the deer.
Alrighty, looks like we got just about everybody here. So folks, this right here is the historic entrance to Mammoth Cave. It has been used by people for about 5,000 years. Quite a long time. And as I've said, we as people have really left our marks behind in this historic entrance. We want to make sure that both you and this cave are staying safe and preserved today. So I just have some additional information for y'all. Folks, stay on the trails, don't go off the trails, and stay with the group. This is the longest cave system in the world at 426 mapped miles. I think that we can all appreciate the idea of sticking together and not getting lost. Now folks, please, when we're in the cave, do not litter and don't take anything outside of the cave. At the end of one of my tours, I had a gentleman give me what he thought was a bottle cap left inside the cave. It was actually an instrument from our science resource management team. So even if it looks like garbage, don't take it out. While we're in the cave, do not touch or mark the cave wall. Our hands have oils on them that can damage the cave wall. We want to try and avoid that. There is an exception to this rule. If you are falling down, feel free to use the cave wall to break your fall. Now folks, if you want to take photos today, that's just fine. Just please be aware of your surroundings. First and foremost, no flash photography. Our eyes are going to adjust to the dim environment in the cave. That flash can discombobulate us. It can also trigger seizures, PTSD, and migraines. Even if you are not susceptible to those, it doesn't mean others aren't. So out of the courtesy of the other guests, please turn off that flash. If you're taking photos, do not walk or run, just stand still. We don't want anybody getting hurt. And last but not least, don't take a million bajillion photos. We have had people miss their tours or make their tours late because they would not stop taking those photos. Now folks, have you seen any cave wildlife today? Photos should be the most you do. Don't touch it, don't interact with it. On the incredibly rare occasion that a bat in particular makes... Alrighty folks, it looks like we have everybody here. So folks, I want to officially welcome you all inside of Mammoth Cave, the world's longest known cave system at 426 mapped miles. Now folks, I say mapped because we estimate that we've only found about half of all of Mammoth Cave. It's really quite a natural wonder. And as I've said, we as people have really left our marks behind on this cave. Now folks, I'm going to ask you to turn off the flash on your devices. As I said, we just want to make sure that nobody's going to suffer from any seizures, PTSD, or migraines today. But moving on, you folks have seen right behind you some of the marks that we've left behind on this cave. I don't think many of you really expected to see big wooden boxes coming down inside of a cave. So you might be wondering when we started to leave our marks here. When was that? Well, for the modern age, there's actually a local folk tale about the first person inside a Mammoth Cave. The story goes that there was a young local boy by the name of John Houchins, maybe about 10 or 12 years old. And one day in 1798, his father gave him a Kentucky long rifle bigger than himself and told him to go out and hunt for dinner. And so John Houchins went out with that Kentucky long rifle, but he wanted to impress his family. He wasn't going to go after something easy. He found a black bear, lifted up that gun, took his aim, and fired. But he did not kill the bear. The bear retreated into Mammoth Cave, and John pursued. Now, the validity of this story is a little up in the air. Some people say it was the bear that pursued John into the cave. But regardless, people were coming inside a mammoth cave and they began leaving their marks. People were graffitiing in the cave, leaving their names behind. In 1812, America became embroiled in a conflict. Now, folks, I'll be brutally honest. I'm terrible with names. So just to make it simple on all of us, I'm going to call this the War of 1812. But if you folks want to correct me later, feel free to do so. So the War of 1812 comes on by, and Mammoth Cave becomes involved in that conflict. Because during and before the war, America was in an embargo. We were not trading with other people. So now that we're involved in this war against the British, we need to supply our own gunpowder. A main ingredient in gunpowder is saltpeter. And wouldn't you know it, there's a couple of caves in Kentucky that are fantastic for making that saltpeter. So you might be wondering how they did that. If you folks ever used an older style coffee maker, you have a decent idea. So they made these large wooden boxes like what you see behind you, called saltpeter vats. They filled those with soil from the cave. Then they made these really long pipes from local tulip poplar trees. You saw some of them come down in that tunnel called Houghton's Narrow. And these pipes brought water down into the cave. That water filtered through the soil. It gets something called niter beer. You then pump that up to the surface where you boil it, you mix it with some other stuff. And then you finally get some saltpeter out of all of that. They estimate it would have taken about 16 pounds of cave soil to make 1 pound of saltpeter. And this operation really didn't leave its mark behind in multiple ways. You'll notice all the mounds behind me. This is dumping from that operation. This is one of the many locations where they would have dumped that cave soil after the water filtered through it. There are other areas of the cave similar to it, and some sections of cave, the floor is actually about a foot lower than it used to be because of that operation of them digging up the cave soil. This was an industrial level operation. It was massive. And the marks that we leave behind on the cave, they are not always good ones, because the physical labor needed to fuel this operation was quite simply gruesome. 12-hour work shifts, your work was backbreaking, and your only source of light in the cave was an oil lantern that gave off far too much smoke. Nobody with a choice wanted to do this kind of work. It was enslaved men, about 70 of them, that were responsible for the physical labor at this operation. I'm sure that in our lives we've done things we did not want to do, things that gave us no benefit to ourselves, but I don't think any of us can really imagine what these men must have been going through, fueling a fight for freedom that they didn't even have. I think it's quite sad that the history of Mammoth Cave has that mark left behind on it, that blemish of slavery on its history. The fact that those men in charge of that operation resorted to slavery to fuel that operation. So this operation does eventually come to an end. In the year 1815, the war is over. And so the prices of saltpeter and gunpowder plummet. There's no more profit to be made off the cave. So the men in charge of the operation, they send the enslaved men back to their original enslavers, and they drop everything and leave. That's why we still have all these marks left behind. That's why we still have the saltpeter vats. That's why we still have the tulip poplar pipes left behind from this operation. And these are just a couple of the many marks that people have left here in Mammoth Cave. Now, you folks might be wondering what Mammoth Cave would look like if we had never left our mark behind. What would have happened if mankind never discovered Mammoth Cave? So thankfully, we do have a time machine in this cave, and we can show you just what the cave would look like. We wouldn't have any cement, we wouldn't have any railings, we wouldn't have any of the lights in the cave. So, I'm going to give the command, and we'll activate this time machine. Go, go, gadget, time machine! Now, if we can try and cover up any devices or watches, anything giving off light, we can try and see total darkness. that's just how Mammoth Cave is when people aren't around. And this is how the cave would be if we had never came here and left our mark behind. It's thanks to us that we can see the cave like we do today with those fancy electric lights and all the cement and the railings. So, I think we've gotten a pretty good taste of this total darkness. I think I'll send us back to the present. Go, go, gadget time machine. Alrighty. So folks, I'm going to make my way to the front of the group, and we're going to continue on to our next stop. Over, folks, and gather around. This will be our next stop. So folks, we've got a plaque over here to check out and some replicas of artifacts that you can look at. So while I'm talking to y'all, if you want to check those out, please feel free to do so. So earlier when I was talking about the first person inside the cave, John Houchins, you might have noticed my language. I said he was the first person in the cave in the modern age. I suppose you could say he was the first person back inside of Mammoth Cave. Because the very first people inside of Mammoth Cave were the prehistoric Native Americans who first discovered Mammoth Cave about 5,000 years ago. Now, of course, you folks might be wondering how they were traversing inside Mammoth Cave without all of the fancy electric lights like what we have now. They took a local plant called cane reed, it looks like bamboo, and they dried it out, they bundled it up, and then set it on fire. And those cane reed torches would get you about 45 minutes of light. So try and imagine that, folks. All you've got are the clothes on your back and a couple of cane reed torches, and you explore into this deep, dark abyss that you've never been to before. The prehistoric Native Americans explored about 17 miles of Mammoth Cave. It's really quite impressive what they were able to achieve. Now, you folks might be wondering, why were these prehistoric Native Americans coming down inside of Mammoth Cave? We have a couple of ideas, but not a lot of them are too concrete, because sadly, we don't have all the information we need, because we don't have all of the marks that they left behind. So we think that they may have been coming in the cave partially for exploration's sake. I don't think it's too crazy to say that regardless of what age of humanity you're looking at, there will always be people that see a dark hole in the ground and go, I wonder what's down there. Furthermore, we think they may have been using the cave for coming-of-age ceremonies. See, we have found fossilized feces inside the cave, and upon hormone testing it, if you don't know what a hormone is, it's just a chemical in your body, they found that a lot of it was from young teenage boys. So we think that the cave may have been used for coming-of-age ceremonies. These were opportunities for these young teenage boys to go through some kind of trial or tribulation, and then upon succeeding, be identified as adult men to the rest of the group. Now, we do know for a fact that these prehistoric Native Americans were coming into the cave for something called gypsum. Gypsum is a mineral that grows inside a Mammoth Cave. It's white and cloudy and sparkly like fresh snow. And the gypsum, it's not valuable like diamonds or gold, but it has a lot of different uses. These prehistoric Native Americans may have been using it for medicine. They may have been using it for paint. They may have been using it to trade with other groups. We're just not entirely sure because gypsum doesn't really leave a mark behind. Gypsum will quickly begin to deteriorate when exposed to sunlight or water, which of course we have a lot of up on the surface. So any of the gypsum that those prehistoric Native Americans brought out of the cave is long gone. The prehistoric Native Americans, they really did leave their mark here in a lot of different ways. We find the marks on the cave wall from when they were taking local muscle cells to chip the gypsum off. And we have found a wide variety of artifacts inside the cave. We have found bowls they created to store the gypsum while going back out of the cave. We have found their moccasins, aka their shoes. We have found those cane reed torches. We've even found their remains. But what's really quite sad is that the marks that we leave behind are not always created when we leave something. They can be created when we take something away. Because when people were coming back inside a mammoth cave during the modern era, around the 1800s, they were taking these artifacts out of the cave. They wanted to put them in their own personal collections or sell them. Sometimes they would burn these artifacts just to warm themselves up inside the cave. We have a journal from a man who came to Mammoth Cave. He was disappointed because he wanted to get 5 wagonfuls of artifacts out of the cave to sell them. And he only came out with 2 wagonfuls full of artifacts. So it's very important that we're careful about how we tell this story, because quite simply, the marks that they left behind were not treated with the respect that they deserved. And I think that we can all hope that our own memories and the own marks that we leave behind will be treated in a way that is respectful after we are gone. So folks, let me see if we have time for some questions. All right, I got a little bit rough. We're gonna have some areas where there might be a little hole here or there. So just make sure to watch your step. We're not gonna go too far this direction. So again, just make sure to watch your step I'm gonna be telling you about the cave itself. I've been talking about the marks that we have left behind, but the cave itself is a mark that nature has left behind, and its story is really quite fascinating. So the story from Mammoth Cave begins quite a long time ago, about 320 million years ago. Up on the surface of Kentucky at that time was a shallow, warm sea. Think like the Bahamas or the Gulf of Mexico. As the life in that sea died, it would fall down to the bottom, and there the shells, the teeth, the skeletons, the calcium from that life would build up and turn into a sort of ooze or slime. And then that would create a layer of limestone. And then it drops into a leaf. You get layer after layer of limestone. And we can see that in this room. We can see the different layers of limestone. You can see some very distinct layers up here, some more distinct layers under, and it just keeps going and going and going. You get layer after layer after layer of limestone. So this limestone forms, and then that shallow, warm sea recedes. It gets lower, and then the limestone is exposed to the elements like the wind and the sun and the rain. Then a river passes through, and it deposits a bunch of sandstone and shale on top of the limestone. So now this limestone is buried under all the soil and sediment and sandstone and shale. What happens next? Well, folks, when you do it at home, happen to have a hose, and when you turn it on, water comes out from where the valve is, little drips. That little dripping is what created Mammoth Cave, believe it or not. So, let me explain myself. Limestone is what makes up Mammoth Cave, and it's primarily made out of calcium. It easily dissolves from something called carbonic acid. If you don't know what that is, it's basically just carbonated water. If you have drank soda, congratulations, you have drank carbonic acid. When it rains, rainwater collects carbonic acid, and it falls down into rivers and streams. Those rivers and streams will flow over sinkholes and cracks in the ground. And that is an opportunity for the water carrying that carbonic acid to drip onto the limestone underground. And that little dripping, given enough time, will carve out the limestone, making a vertical shaft, such as a pit or a dome. So that vertical water makes that vertical shaft, and then water can begin to build up underground. That water has to get out somewhere. The water that gets into Mammoth Cave is feeding into the Green River up on the surface. So enough water got underground to form an underground river. So these underground rivers carve out the passageways, like what we are in right now. Now these underground rivers, folks, I do have to burst your bubble. They are not as cool as you think. They're not these fast whitewater rapids. They're very slow, very calm. Sometimes they don't even look like they're moving at all. And they are the reason we are called Mammoth Cave. We're not called Mammoth Cave because of any mammoths. Never had mammoths here. We're called Mammoth Cave because of the mammoth-sized passageways we have. See, the slower those underground rivers were moving, the larger a passageway they would carve out, and vice versa. So if we go back to that hose I was talking about, let's say you turn it on, you leave it on the ground. The water coming out will slowly but surely make a bigger and wider puddle. But if you take that same hose, you put your thumb over it, now the water moving in a much smaller area, but a lot more quickly. And the same goes for the water that made Mammoth Cave, as I said. So these really big passageways we're in were made by that slower moving water. Now, these underground rivers are getting lower and lower. Right now, we're approximately 160 feet below the surface. These underground rivers are 400 feet below the surface, because the Green River on the surface is getting lower. And water is lazy. Doesn't want to have to go up to meet the Green River, doesn't want to have to go down. It wants to stay at the same level. So as the Green River on the surface is getting lower, the water in the cave is doing the same. And that's why it's now 400 feet below the surface. And it's still carving out brand new cave. Now, when the water left this section of cave, the weaker layers of limestone fell off. And that's what creates the breakdown, like what we can see behind us. So I'm going to turn on my flashlight. I don't think I'll blind anybody. Yeah, oh, sorry. There we go. Yep, right there. So we have some breakdown over there. We have breakdown over here. We have a breakdown back over this direction. So this is from when the river left this section of cave. Those weaker layers did fall off. And if you look at the passageway, you'll notice a very distinct arch shape. That is the strongest shape it can possibly take in nature. It's very stable, very sturdy. Any of the weak layers of limestone that would have fallen off have already done so long before people ever found the cave. And that's what makes the cave so sturdy and stable, where we don't really have to worry about any kind of collapse or breakdown nowadays. And it's also why the ceiling looks so flat. Because when the weaker layers of limestone fell off, they exposed another layer of limestone. And this one wasn't exposed to water nearly as much as, let's say, the limestone on the walls. So you'll notice the limestone on the walls is very jagged and edged. It's got those nice round edges. But then on the ceiling, it's a lot more flat. It's still got some erosion there, but it's a lot more flat because it hasn't been exposed to the water nearly as long. And so that's the basic story of how Mammoth Cave was created. But Mammoth Cave is also sustained by something special. A lot of you folks coming into a cave would have expected a lot of formations and water falling down to the ceiling. Mammoth Cave is unique in the fact that it doesn't really have a lot of that. Because of that sandstone up on the surface, it acts like a roof for the cave. It keeps water from getting in. And without water slowly dripping down from the ceiling, you cannot get formations. And those formations will eventually one day destroy cave, because those formations will either grow together and block off a section of cave, or they'll become so heavy that the ceiling will fall. So thanks to that lack of formations, that helps Mammoth Cave sustain itself. We don't really have to worry, like I said, about any kind of breakdown or anything like that. It's a really unique environment that allows Mammoth Cave to be what it is, the longest cave system in the world. Alrighty, looks like we're right on time. We have 431 locations. Each one tells a story about the marks that we have left behind. And I truly feel that if you connect those dots and look at the marks that we as Americans have left behind, you can discover who we truly are as Americans and what makes us American. So folks, before I truly wrap up the tour, if you folks have any questions, any at all, you feel free to raise your hand. Yes? That means they only live in Mammoth Cave, and we wanted to protect those species. So the cave has not changed a lot in the past 60 years, but the tours certainly have. I can take he's got a knock on his door. His house is right up on the area out here. So his land, he has a little bit about a little bit left over there. And he got that knock on his door. There was a man that said, "Sir, I will pay you if you take me down to the cave and let me see what's in there." And that began that tourism here in Mammoth Cave. It was the late 1830s, around 1837, that Stephen Bishop was brought here by his enslaver, a man named Mr. Gorham. Mr. Gorham would actually come to own Mammoth Cave, and Stephen Bishop became a tour guide here. And Stephen Bishop was truly an incredible man. He was highly intelligent. He could run circles around any scientist that came to the cave. Furthermore, we think that he may have had photographic memory. He was able to make a perfect map of what he had seen in Mammoth Cave from memory. And Stephen Bishop, the tours he was giving were different than the tours we have now. The tours back then were split between short tours and long tours. Short tours were anywhere between 4 and 8 hours long. Long tours could be anywhere from about 10 to 16 hours long. So he was truly made of different stuff. And Stephen Bishop, he was also a very, as I said, intelligent man. He was, what's the word? When you're good at using your tools around you. I don't know why the word is slipping my mind. But when he first came to Mammoth Cave, tourists could not get past a section of the cave called the bottomless pit. It is 105 feet deep. And so one day a gentleman came to Stephen Bishop and he asked him, Stephen, I'll give you all the money in my pocket if you take me to a part of the cave that no one has ever been to before. And Stephen Bishop had already had an idea on how to get past that bottomless pit. But this was the perfect opportunity to try. So he got an oil lantern and a ladder. And he headed down to the bottomless pit with that gentleman. He then took that ladder and he plunged it over the opening to the bottomless pit. He then took that lantern, put it in his teeth, and rung by rung, he clawed over the opening to the bottomless pit. The story goes that he would get out to the other side. He would turn around to that gentleman and ask him, "You coming?" So they did get across and they continued on. They discovered a section of the cave that is nowadays called River Hall. Stephen Bishop got to a section of the cave that nowadays is called Mammoth Dome. A dome, a vertical shaft that is 170 feet tall. When Stephen Bishop got there, he noticed something on the ground. A broken lantern. He was confused by this. He thought he was the first person in this section of the cave. He took that broken lantern. He returned to the surface. He went to the housing for the enslaved guys, and he got to the front porch there, where one of the old guys who used to work at the saltpeter industry here noticed the lantern that Stephen was holding, and he said, "Stephen, where did you find my lantern?" Stephen asked him, "What do you mean, your lantern?" Back when the saltpeter operation was in high effect here, the enslaved workers went out and would get saltpeter, or they would explore the cave to find areas where they could dig out more saltpeter. They went down a section of the cave nowadays known as Littleback, and there was a hole there leading to the Mammoth Dome. But of course they didn't know what was beyond. So they took a chair and they tied a rope to it. They put that gentleman in the chair and they slowly lowered him down. But he dropped his lantern, he started to freak out. And they eventually got him back up and out. And that is how that lantern got its Mammoth Dome for Stephen Bishop to discover years later. Now, Stephen Bishop would eventually sue for his freedom and would succeed. He did pass away a year later, but I think it was a good comfort to him knowing that he was passing away a free man. Now, folks, I don't know if that rain's going to be letting up anytime soon.
这间8月才开张的 Spring Hill 早餐用餐环境。晚上的时候呢是吧台，吧台后面 就是早餐区，餐饮还就是美式的 Continental， 有果汁、yogurt， 现在已经都收了。咖啡区，他准备的这个麦片的 cup 还蛮丰富的，齐全。早上还下着雨，所以呢，户外的这个 lecture time 呢的地方呢，湿淋淋的。游泳池在户外，还算蛮 cozy 的一个地方。旁边还有这个名字 Event Center， 名字 Event Center 在过去就是 Casino， 还有 Jacuzzi 耶 Center。因为有聚会的关系，所以妹妹就没有帮我们升到等。